Well, Culminators, thank you for joining me on this cloudy day in Newark. For me, it's June 22nd. You'll see this a little bit further out. By then, I'm sure the sun will have cleared up. But if it hasn't, you've come to the right place because I've got Jim Hanson, who is the executive director, if you didn't know, of the plan for the counterattack of AmericaMatters.com, of the book that he wrote, Winning the Second Civil War Without Firing a Shot, Jim Hanson. There's a video, there's all the things, there's the handsome face.
Look just like me.
It looks just like you, except a little bit more contrast. What's going on, man?
Hey, good to be with you, Ron. There's all kinds of stuff going on, and I don't know. I think the badness of it is good for us. How about that?
I'm glad to hear that. Well, in certain respects, that's right. I mean, the worse it gets, the better it gets, as long as we're allowed to make it better. One of the things you and I talked about briefly before we started recording is they don't want us to they don't want to let us make it better. You and I have been conversing mostly offline for a long time, and sometimes with our friend Kurt Schlichter, about basically insurrection-y stuff that we want to do. And we are dangerous to the state. Right now, we're still allowed to have this discussion and to share it with America, but who knows when they'll pull the plug on us. You mentioned something in our little warm-up here that you think is the threat du jour. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the old threats have receded, but something that is all the hottest talk across the fruited plain and in Washington as well, red flag laws. What's your take on this?
Yeah, well, as I sit on my perch on the ridge overlooking Washington, D.C., our own team is deserting us. The rhinos have caved to the requirement to do something about
surprisingly.
Yeah, I know. Well, they do it every time. We should be used to it. And I think, to be honest, first thing I'll say is the gun law that they're talking about, the gun bill they're talking about, is much less egregious than it could have been, and then honestly that I expected. There is no assault weapon ban. There's no magazine ban. They didn't change the ownership ages. There's a lot of things they wanted to do, the left did, that they didn't. But the one thing that the right caved on was to get the phrase red flag laws into play. And they didn't make it a federal red flag law, which I think is a bonus. But what they're doing is they're giving money to the states.
Well, the biggest bonus of all right there, the biggest bonus of not making it a federal law is that it won't be enforced by the FBI.
Yeah, and federalism is our friend. Right now, I mean, we are gathering into our tribes by which states are run by people who agree with us. So I think if you are someone who is a conservative, you should consider living in a conservative state, because otherwise you're going to be under the thumb of the feds who don't want that. But by not making a federal law, they're simply throwing money at states that want to do that. And I think that's good. If it was a federal law, the FBI could use it to attack political opponents and those who dissent in ways because of what they say online. I make a lot of comments online about how if the government ever gets too tyrannical, I will work to actively overthrow it using my Second Amendment rights. That may, at some point, if the feds got their way, become a reason to grab my guns. And so we dodged that bullet, to go mix some good metaphors. And they only made it, some money for the states. So I think that allows our governors, our Republican governors, to not have red flag laws, or if you're Ron DeSantis, to get rid of the one in Florida.
So, I mean, I think you'd agree that if you left it up to the usual suspects, what you just described, that wouldn't be a someday situation. That would be right now. I mean, what they've done with the January 6th business, turning it into the Reichstag fire of the 21st century, as an excuse to, clamp down on political opposition. Thank God, not quite as violently, but don't ask that of anyone who's been arrested in connection with January 6th. You just basically said, I reserve the right, the God-given right, to oppose tyranny by armed force if necessary. That that's insurrection, right?
That is a threat of insurrection, I guess, at some level. I mean, that's the really fine line. The founders put the Second Amendment in play specifically because they had just done a violent revolution against a tyrannical government to overthrow it, and they did not want the government to have a monopoly on the ability to commit violence, and consequently, for the people to have a right to vote against tyranny if it got to that point, with their own lives and the weapons they need to do that. So I think yes, but I fear, and I think legitimately, like you said, that given the right people in power in Washington and in the courts, they would do what Beto O'Rourke wants, and I'd have him kicking on my door, saying, "Here you go, give me all of your semi-automatic weapons. You can keep one revolver for self-defense." And that's not what the founders wanted, and we won't accept that. So I think this, at some level, we dodged a bullet with this minor victory in the midst of the usual rhino collapse and defeat.
Well, I mean, to be fair, if this is the bill that came out of the committee, it would seem that there wasn't such a collapse. In other words, you're saying, well, if there had been no collapse at all, there'd be no bill at all. But given that politics is what politics is, and given that the Republic, I do think one thing we have to always remember is that Republicans Republicans are in playing on an even playing field, right?
Right.
They are in. It isn't just our ideas versus their ideas, our personalities versus their personalities. It is essentially every institution in the United States that isn't a PAC or a lobby, and most that are. The academy, law enforcement, most of law enforcement, every federal agency, right now, both houses of Congress, the judiciary. Republicans don't really have the option of standing as firmly as it's easier as we armchair quarterbacks would like them to do. So to a large extent, in order to, to sort of keep the fires burning and live to fight another day, they agreed to what I think you're describing as a fairly toothless, well, look, we've done something kind of bill. Would that be a fair way of putting it?
Yeah, and I think you described O'Sullivan's Law, which is any organization that is not inherently conservative becomes liberal over time, and I think we've seen pretty much all of them follow that law.
Well,
but I think to your point,
oh yeah, I just want to remind people here who are not familiar with your background that you are a former Army Special Forces weapon. You are a former Army Special Force weapon, I guess, or multiple weapons. That includes the armed forces. O'Sullivan's Law doesn't it? Astonishingly, would you have ever thought it when you were in the
sadly.
service?
No, and up till 5 or 6 years ago, I would have laughed at anyone who claimed, that we'd be having pronoun days and safe space training in the military. It's absurd, but and we can fight back against that. And I understand the anger of people, and as you were describing, the idea that if we collapse at all, we give away the whole farm. Well, politics is never an all or nothing kind of game. And I think our team needs to go ahead and understand that. We can push back, and we should. We should primary the rhinos. We should push back on them and all that. But at some level, you have to understand that politicians will do politics. And when it comes to next election day, we're not going to vote against someone who did something we don't like when they vote with us 80+% of the time. We're going to pull the lever for the guy or gal who is on our side against someone who's an obvious enemy. And I think that's where I think the purists need to go ahead and be angry. I don't blame you. I'm angry. Right. But understand what you said is we're dealing with politics and politicians. They're never going to have the spines we want.
There is one personality in particular who it's kind of hard to figure out what side he's on that particular battle. His name is Donald J. Trump. Some of his endorsements this year for the midterms have been, how shall we put it, hard to understand.
Sketchy. Yeah.
What's going on, Jim? What do you think's going on back there?
The same thing that's always been going on. Trump is not, he doesn't have an ideology. He has Trumpism as his guiding force. So he likes people he likes. He likes celebrities. You know, he's got a known set of personnel related problems that have plagued him, you know, through his whole administration. And I think he saved the country. You know, the three justices he put on the Supreme Court saved us from the possibility of an actual insurrection had Hillary been the one appointing them. So, because I think they would be gathering our guns and we would be under a hate speech restriction had she appointed three
Oh,
liberal
gosh.
Sotomayors, right? So I will never, you know, I have my issues with Trump, but he will go down in history as saving the republic. But to your point, he absolutely has a tendency to go on personality rather than, you know, principles. And I think that has shown up in Dr. Oz and some of these other, you know, unpleasant um, places where he's backed the wrong person. And you know, we know that, and we'll see how it goes. I think he's going to be primaried. I don't think he has a clear walk to the Republican nomination. You know, obviously Pence and Pompeo want a shot. Ted Cruz probably wants a shot, and I think Ron DeSantis is smartly staying on the sidelines, waiting to see how it plays out. But you know, Trump has not done himself any favors with some of those decisions.
No, I think he hasn't. And listen, I don't think that's really our topic. We can handicap the Donald Trump's political future in a couple of years. Uh, Although, you know, I'm sure he's already made some decisions that he's just not sharing with us. Um, you mentioned, you know, you and I have been talking for a long time about what the government is doing to suppress dissent, and you know, you talk about the red flags. Um, we've talked a lot about tech tech censorship. I had a very interesting conversation, which I late last week, which I posted this yesterday as episode 71 on the ColemanNation with Ashley Baker from the Committee for Justice, and it was interesting because I don't like getting schooled, uh, but it happens, and it happens not only to the best of us, but at the hands of the best of us. Randy Barnett once left me with a black eye, and I think that Adrian Vermeule, frankly, it was a technical knockout on his part. I mean, we are talking about some of the smartest people in the world. Ashley is it's a very, very young person, so that's a little bit harder for me to take. But she is the director of the Committee for Justice and the Allied Antitrust group. And I thought I'd have a great conversation with her about why we should be using antitrust law to regulate big tech. And that's something I've heard from in my discussions with guys like Ken Buck and Joe Kent, one guy who's in Congress, one guy who wants to get into Congress. And she hit the brakes so fast on that and said, basically, you really want to turn both the Antitrust Division and the Federal Trade Commission into two more agencies that are going to be political water bearers for one party? Because you know, what's the name of your Irishman's law again?
O'Sullivan.
O'Sullivan.
Yeah.
She didn't quote O'Sullivan's law, but if it's going to be done by the government, then that means it's going to be done by the deep state. And if it's going to be done by the deep state, you're not going to like how it comes out. And it definitely gave me some pause. You ever think about it in those terms?
I mean, any conservative who is worthy of the name believes that government is rarely ever the answer. And I think it's kind of, it's the tool of last resort. If we've exhausted every other possibility, I'm willing to use government power. I'm willing to use executive power because in a lot of places right now, we're beaten so badly that the normal methods no longer have any effect that's going to work. I got to say, the most recent thing that might have changed my mind about this is Elon Musk putting in an offer for Twitter. If he buys Twitter, the game changes. And he picked a fight that I think we need to have in public, and the left bit. He said, I'm for free speech. They said, we're for the thought police. And I'm like, yes, even more than the fact that it would be nice for our ideas to have a place, to compete somewhat fairly. It's more important to frame the issue as the idea of free speech short of incitement to violence per Brandenburg and the thought police trying to make sure nobody's feelings get hurt, which is a lost cause. I want to have that argument, and I think Elon Musk has done more to help us in non-governmental ways, which is the preferred technique, than anyone else. I wish we had more billionaires like him.
And I wish that you were one of them, Jim.
Oh, the world would be in for it if I had that kind of money. I call
Well,
it FU money.
Yeah, well,
because you
or
don't have to
even
care what anyone thinks.
even the interest on that kind of money for a
Right?
couple of months, for a couple of days. Um, there's no question that Elon Musk in my view, has already changed the game, and it
Right.
looks like he's actually getting closer to really closing that deal. It is weird, isn't it, how the Twitter people keep switching on and off the shadow banning and the algorithm games again. I just
Yeah,
I
I
don't.
see it on almost a weekly basis. Because I follow my stats because we've done a lot of work on this. We helped
Oh, that's right.
expose the
You have.
original shadow bans, and the quality filter, we helped kill that
Or
by
take a
just
step back. Tell me
examining
when
it.
you say is we. You don't mean we the royal we. Tell me who you're talking. Tell me what. Tell me and our
Security
friends what we're
Studies
talking
Group.
about.
Yeah, Security Studies Group did a look when Twitter put out what they called the quality filter. And we did some digging behind the scenes with some pretty powerful tools. And this was when they banned some Republican, or they put a quality filter on some Republican candidates and Congress people's accounts, but not on their Democrat opponents. So there was a legitimate reason this was a public concern, not a private concern. And what they did is they simply created a quality filter that allowed the left to use a heckler's veto. And once you got a certain number of strikes against your account and complaints against your account, they downgraded your reach. And it was an official thing, and they were dumb enough to announce it was the problem. They let us know it was happening instead of letting us wonder. And so we gave Congress some of the ammo about how that was going on and told them what questions to ask. And then Twitter backed down and they pulled it and went to trickier things like you mentioned, like using their algorithms and even just using the inherent bias of their employees who do the actual sorting of complaints and the sorting of violations to decide, oh, well, these are worth, go ahead and taking away people's reach for, and these aren't. So it's been a long fight, but I think by scaring them into wondering whether he's going to be their new boss, Elon has changed the game. And I think if this closes and the board voted unanimously for it, then he can go in and tell them that's no longer a policy I will allow. And I will be as happy as anyone could be because our ideas win if people can see them.
I mean, that really is something that you see. I mean, that's the difference between a system that is confident in its, in its ideological foundations and in its first principles, and one that isn't. But I don't think either you or I, or anyone listening, needs to be reminded of that. It's obvious to reasonable people. I mean, I do think, and I think that actually Elon thinks also that the standard in our ideal Jim Hanson or Elon Musk run Twitter is may not actually be a Brandenburg kind of everything but, you know, incitement to violence. Because from what I've seen him tweet and what I would tweet if I were he, I do think that Twitter did a very good job cleaning up a lot of racial and ethnic abuse. When I first kind of started getting my nose above the water and getting noticed, I used to get some really, really disgusting anti-Semitic Holocaust imagery and stuff, and that crowd is pretty much gone now. Uh, but the problem is, it's obvious you shouldn't be allowed to call someone the N word, or write a, or you say obvious again. Under Brandenburg it wouldn't be obvious, but under the reasonable man standard, the humane, let's not be a disgusting place, even if we're a strictly legal place. I do think that what they've done, this is becoming now a theme of the last several episodes of this podcast, is they've changed the definitions. In other words, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, we would all agree it would be inappropriate for someone to be allowed to stay in a decent social media community if he called black people the N word, and he called, I don't want to go through the slurs, but used traditional ethnic slurs as we understand them. And I think we would all agree that there would be consensus on that. But what's happened now is that we're required to acknowledge every bit as validly, every bit as solidly, that doubting whether a man has really made himself a woman or is really a woman, or vice versa, or calling a black person white who insists, well, it's usually the other way around, right? Whatever these rules are, and they're printing new ones every day. We have to adhere to these as soon as they are promulgated, as soon as the memo gets out. So there are all these people who have been kicked off Twitter, not for saying the N word, not for saying it's springtime for Hitler in Germany, but for saying things like, hey, here's an approach to treating COVID that's different from what the government says, and here's why I want you to listen to me about it. Or, I don't think California did a great job of monitoring election security. Or, that's not a woman, that's a guy.
Yeah,
that is the problem.
No, and you're absolutely right. And I said Brandenburg, and you're right. There has to be a reasonable man standard. The problem is it hasn't been reasonable, as you pointed out. They have completely hijacked the language and made the standard to allow people to not be offended. And the problem is, once you get to that, once offense is the standard as opposed to incitement to violence, you got a slippery slope of some sort. And in our case, it's a slippery slope going both directions. So the question becomes, what is the minimum amount of censorship you can do to truly offensive ideas and speech that does not affect the ability for opposing viewpoints and ideas to be fairly evaluated, even if they are edgy, even offensive? And I think that's kind of a place where I think Elon's closer to the truth, closer to what I would consider the truth being the chance for ideas to fight in a marketplace and the best ones win. And I think that includes things that the left does not want to be said. And so they've been very successful in creating that thought policed environment where woke dogma is the standard. And I think if he breaks that, and then Twitter is a place where you can actually fight out opposing viewpoints and things can be said, that's going to affect all the rest of the platforms as well. And I think in a positive way.
That's right. And even if that weren't to happen, even if you were to make no substantive changes whatsoever, but said we're going to add some transparency or accountability or both, because I guess they're really two sides of the same coin. And when we say that something, first of all, we're going to tell you why you were banned. Mm-hmm. And second of all, we're going to tell you what standards we applied, and we're going to apply them consistently. That is really what's missing from above all, what's missing from the equation now is any sense of good faith or consistency.
And I think part of that is the internal bias at Twitter and Google and Facebook and the rest of these tech tyrannies is so overwhelmingly leftist that their confirmation bias is worse than the Vatican. I mean, they don't have any ability to see differing ideas as anything but evil at this point. If you cross one of those lines, if you refuse to accept a trans man or woman as what they claim to be, not what their biology says, then you must be banned, you must be shut down because you're dangerous. And that, I think, back to the way we got into this, that concept has been weaponized by the Biden DHS in their partnerships with the tech companies, because they're now giving guidance, official guidance, as to what they think can cause domestic terrorism if it is allowed to propagate on social media. And that horrifies me. So I think if we can put a stake in the heart of the idea that the tech company's job is to censor things that the left doesn't want and that the state wants shut down, we will have done the world a disservice or a service, and allowed America to be the country that is the leader in free speech worldwide.
Well, that it is really important, and you know, let's go back to first principles of being a conservative. Why? I mean, it's not as if everyone who listens to this doesn't have an idea, but I'd like to, if I can, get your idea of why the hell do we need to depend on Twitter to do this for us? Elon Musk comes along, who knows what he's really going to do? Why isn't it good enough to just go to an alternative platform, get our views expressed somewhere else?
Well, there's a concept in technology called the network effect, which means when the network gets to a certain number of nodes, in this case users or whatever, that it's near impossible to overcome that as a startup. And that's just from a pure technological perspective. Then if you add into that the idea that any of the startups that are against, that are basically focused on conservative ideas, the left will never join. So you can never get to that critical mass that Twitter has, that Facebook has, that Google and YouTube have, where they've got both sides there already and they have their monopoly established. And the network effect makes it difficult to compete. And any startup then also has the difficulty that the left won't join. So I think we have to fight for the ones that exist. That's why I may disagree that antitrust laws is the best way to go, or agree that it's not the best way, but it may be the only way when Google and Facebook control 60% of online advertising, and you can't ask a question online anywhere to get any kind of information without getting it filtered through a leftist lens, because Google controls so much of the search. So those are things that I don't think you can overcome using any other way, and we may have to use the government power and state power to overcome that, and then deal with the consequences of having created a more of a bureaucratic nightmare, and try to neuter them afterwards.
I think you're right, and I think also that if you get that process going, then you at least you're shining some daylight, some sunshine into how these decisions are made. And the reason there hasn't been even a sort of friendly antitrust settlement, a consent decree of some kind, because there are obviously issues out there. They involve search. Forget about social media itself, because it is hard to evaluate what the market is. If Twitter is the only Twitter, I mean, Twitter is the only Twitter,
Right.
So we can imitate Twitter. But that's like saying you and I could go into the garage and start a car company. Okay, so it worked for it worked for Mr. Musk, but it hasn't made any money. Actually, it's made him money. Nonetheless, you at least get. I think the reason that hasn't happened is that because you would have to be approval by a judge. There would be people who would try to intervene, and these government agencies are by and large pretty friendly to these guys, and they're largely staffed by them. And of course, there's this tremendous amount of money that Google spends uh, in Congress, including to uh, giving support to a lot of Republicans. I you know it is funny to me. You mentioned before. It took me a second to find it. The idea that offendedness is the criterion. I had a couple of weeks ago. I had the rare pleasure of really interviewing what I think would you could call the Jim Hanson of the UK. By that I mean Count Dankula.
Oh, he's a wild man.
He is a mad lad, you might say, and he is. I really was taken by him. I actually like. I It's about the only podcast I listen to. It's just because he explains. He's got a staff of writers. They do this research on these interesting historical figures. I generally don't like listening to podcasts because they take too long to listen to. I read ridiculously fast, and I don't. But his accent, I can't do a Scottish accent in my head. Just to listen to him say these things. But one of the things we were talking about was how in the UK he was arrested for posting a tasteless video, and we both confirmed that it was tasteless and inappropriate. He's not an anti-Semite, but anyone looking at that video might think he was, or might think that he just had a really bad sense of humor. Blah blah blah. And he explained to me how the only criterion in under UK law for a prima facie case of being arrested for a hate crime, which is a real crime. I mean, for wrong speech, hate speech in the UK, is if the complainant feels offended. Is if the complainant feels offended. So what? Amazingly, though, if that's really, this was yesterday's tweet from the something called the USA Singers.
Oh my.
Can you freaking imagine? And of course, yes, I did report it because it is defamatory. It is defamatory, and Jen is a friend. Um, Insane. It is insane that that kind of stuff uh, happens. But and culturally, it's a disaster. But what we can say is that Twitter definitely has a policy of deleting stuff or banning stuff for people if they're offensive. Offensive, they love offensive. It gets engagement going. They just don't like certain kinds of offensive. You got to go get the pizza from the front door, Jim.
I don't have to. I think that's already handled. But I think you've outlined the problem. Is who decides what's offensive? That's the problem with thought policing. Is there is no way in a culture now on the left where they have been trained to be grievance mongers. Your entire existence, you're divided into your identity groups, and then in your identity group, you have to find an issue to be aggrieved about, and then you gather together and force some sort of spoils or payment from whoever has offended you. Maybe that's banning them, sometimes it's money, whatever. And there's an entire culture built around it, and built around the idea that you somehow have a right to be free from offense. And you manifestly do not, per the Constitution, but for private organizations, they can pander to whoever they want, but you can't ever satisfy that sense of entitled grievance, that these people have cultivated. So I think we need to push the bar for offensive back towards Lenny Bruce and away, from the idea that Ricky Gervais is now the new Hitler. You can say things that hurt people's feelings and that are rude and that are even crude. If they're not legally actionable, or they're not in some way, creating such an environment of hatred that reasonable people, not woke leftists, would agree that that's, beyond the pale, then I think that has to be accepted. And then you get back what we have lost as a culture, the ability to shame people who suck. There are plenty of them. And we should bring back shaming, because that's the correct answer for someone who does a tweet like you showed. I don't want them, if they defamed her and she's got a legal action, okay, great, she can do it, she's a lawyer. But really what should happen is everybody who knows and can see to the USA singers who did that should tell them how crude, rude, and socially unacceptable that was, and how we will not deal with you, shun you or do that, rather than having the institution or the platform be in the position of refereeing beefs between perpetually aggrieved leftists and edgy, rightists. I think
But
that's no good
culturally
for
speaking,
anybody.
how does that happen? How does that? I mean, it's not. I don't know whether Twitter made everyone nastier or everyone was nasty and Twitter's allowing them to show it. But can that genie ever go back in the bottle? What has to happen?
At Well, at some level, so what? I mean, okay. People call me names. I'm sure you're well aware. They call you names. They call me every name and every insult in the world. And the correct answer to that is who cares? Now that's difficult. And then there are, sustained campaigns where someone
No. But
big
who
on the
cares?
left
Who
will.
cares? We care, right? Because you're talking about getting us back to a place where shame exists, where accountability for antisocial expressions of hatred and all the things has some consequences.
Okay, no, and that's fair. I think maybe I explained that poorly. I'm saying if someone reminds me that I'm bald or that I'm old or that I'm white, which happens all the time, or old, bald, white guy happens quite a bit, that needs to be ignored. But when you get down to truly offensive, rude, crude things, I think the element of shame is a better answer to that than any sort of institutional action. But I want, on the part of all the people who are willing to feel offended, why don't we ratchet up our personal body armor a notch or two and go ahead and not care about more of that stuff and save it for the truly ridiculous things and the truly absurd and the truly mean and cruel and offensive things, as opposed to, what we've gotten at this point, which is, oh my God, you called me a name, you must be killed. And I think if we push the bar back towards the right to offend away from the right to be free from offense, that's the correct direction. And then we can at least take it from there.
Okay, so finishing off here, you think that's something we should do? You don't seem to have necessarily a better idea of how to do it than I do, besides just girding our loins, fighting the good fight, not giving in where we don't have to give in. Is there anything you think from a civic or organizational or organizing point of view that we could do to move things in that direction?
I think tone matters, and there's a lot of my friends right now are very ready, and myself included, are ready to fight, rhetorically, figuratively, and hopefully not literally, but to stop taking it, because for too long we on the right have basically tried to maintain the moral high ground, and we will not get and sling mud and all that stuff. And I think what happened is, as we've done that, we've probably gone too far. And I don't think we're done yet. I'll be honest. I don't think we have managed to fight hard enough yet to show that we're willing to do anything. But at some point, we have to be willing to say, given this set of circumstances, meaning free speech and lack of censorship and no thought police and those kinds of things, we will, as a community, get back to the Judeo-Christian values that made this country great and that kind of police that, that give you a moral framework for how you should deal with other people. But as long as those other people are still, as they are now, trying to shut us up by abusing state power, I don't think we can get there. So I think we're probably a generation away from that. But I think it's okay to start saying that should be the end goal. And how can we, in the meantime, create a free speech safe space that will allow us then to stop being such jerks to each other?
Jim, thank you very much. Great having
Always
you
a
on
pleasure.
and talking and poking your shiny pate to see what's under there.
I'm
And
offended.
coming from me especially. Okay, I'll see you see you at the races, and we'll talk again soon. Thank you.